Well, we're going to get started here this morning. Thank you so much for coming to this. I'm so happy to see a packed room. This is fantastic. We're going to talk this morning about phased occupied K-12 school modernizations. Really quickly, my name is Gavin Myers. I am a principal and partner at Hughes Group Architects and have about 15 years of educational experience. I am the leader of the K-12 studio, and to my left here is Joe Saunders. He's a senior associate, the senior associate of the K-12 studio. And between the two of us, we have over 50 years of educational experience. So as you can see, we enjoy hiking and horseback riding, long walks on the beach. So the reality is that we do want to keep this jovial. If you want to yell out questions in between, please feel free to do so. A little bit about our firm. Hughes Group Architects is based in Sterling, Virginia. We're just down the road from here and basically just outside DC. We've been in practice for 39 years. And over the past 8 years or so, we have over 24 K-12 school projects totaling over 1.5 million square feet of K-12 space in the DC metro area. And critical to that is that 98% of our projects are renovations, modernizations, and additions. And that's conscious. We, frankly, do not pursue a lot of new work. We look at the opportunities within the existing buildings. We like to breathe new life into old schools, and that's our hallmark. And a large majority of all that work is actually phased occupied renovations. So I like to have agendas. Here's what we're going to hit on today. We're going to hit on the drivers of phased occupied renovations, the process our firm uses when we're planning out phased occupied renovations, and the key considerations of that, as well as 3 projects we currently have done that we use as case studies. So let's go ahead and dive into it. So the key driver is why renovate? Assuming that obviously the renovation has been selected instead of new construction. You look at this and you say that there's 3 key drivers for us that we see most often. Obviously, it's growth in the student population. They don't have enough space, they need to actually expand it. Or addressing the existing facility deficiencies, whether this be a building that is old and actually basically has deficiencies, is decrepit, being able to actually update that, modernize that, or even bring the school up to current standards, whether this be 21st century learning and the current ed specs of whatever facility it's in. And obviously, always in today's world, updating it for security and safety. Those are the 3 key right there as far as why, key drivers for renovation that we see. Similar to that is the approaches we see for actual renovations and additions. And most often we see the summer blitz, which is pure mayhem is a nice word sometimes. I'm sure plenty of experience that it is 24/7 construction. It is a tight schedule, typically done within 3 months. And it has to be highly coordinated with the abilities of the general contractor doing the work because you can't overtax them. The reality is you need to accurately scale the scope and the budget according to the time available. Swing schools, we don't see that often, but it is a luxury. And some districts do have extra schools, assuming the school is actually up to par and can actually serve as a swing school. It's a fantastic opportunity. We don't see it that often, but that is swinging the students off-site. It allows for that to occur. And then the rare one is reassignment. This is where you take the student body of one school and you distribute them amongst multiple schools. And the disruption that occurs in here, administratively overhead as far as the student population, is challenging. And so we don't see this at all, frankly. We very rarely have seen it. So we oftentimes see an occupied renovation. And this focuses on swinging on site. This keeps students on site, administration on site, but it requires a high level of planning and a high level of potentially phasing depending on the scale of the work. So you can see both of these slides prior, the renovation and then the actual drivers for it, they all tie together into the process. These are what informs our process first and foremost, the approach that's being taken and why. And so we're going to get into that process here. So the way our firm works is we have a 5-stage process here that we go through. Assess, define, confirm, refine, and adjust. And these 5 stages, in between each of these stages, there's opportunity and there's consensus building that occurs. So we're going to break each of these down. So in the assess stage, first and foremost, you deal with assessing the existing facility. What does that existing facility offer as far as an opportunity, What does it offer as far as constraints? For example, historic facilities. That's critical to understanding that first and foremost. Similar to that, you have to understand and assess the needs, the programmatic needs of the school. That's going to drive key decisions as to how much can fit within the existing facility and how much always needs to be either added or repurposed. Opportunities, finding the opportunities within the existing facility. Again, if there's opportunities for infill, there's opportunities for repurposing, there's opportunities for expansion and additions. All that comes into play where we explore multiple opportunities and options, and then we build consensus around those options. So that's the first stage as far as the assessment is concerned.
One of the key things, if I can jump in for a second,
Please.
Gavin, is that the consensus building is a critical component. As Gavin mentioned, that you're going to see that in all of our steps in the process along the way, because that consensus has to be not only the design team, but if you want to call it a larger design team, where you've got the school leadership team is involved, the school administration team from the school system, if they've got facilities and design people, they're involved. We get the teachers involved. Oftentimes the students are involved in building consensus on the phasing schemes, because as you're going to hear, this theme is going to come throughout the process. It's all about them. It's what's going to take care of their school the best way. So there are lots of very efficient ways that we can phase a project and roll right through the building in a very efficient, very cost-effective way that may not suit the needs of the school. And that's got to come first.
So that's the assess stage. After the assess stage comes the define stage. And this starts with establishing the scope of each phase. And what I mean by that is understanding surely the extent of how much you can bite off at that point. Understanding at that point, potentially taking a look at temporary facilities and what that's going to entail as far as the opportunities for that. Align the phase with the schedule, we kind of touched on that already, and then identify as a critical aspect of define. That's identifying who moves, and this is broad as far as, for example, does English move? Does math move? Does science move? Who moves where, and where is where? And there are key considerations with this is talking about, for example, English can move much more readily, for example, than a science lab. And this is starting to be talked about at this point in the stage.
And there's things that happen during phases where phase 2 might want to move a computer lab out of the way. Well, we can't do that, so what we may do is we may have to take that lab, move it into one of the newly finished spaces temporarily, and then that means that somebody else is going to stay out in a temporary facility a little bit longer. And so that's where working with the school leadership team, things like that determine. So as Gavin said, it's not quite as straightforward as just moving one domino to the next to the next.
And this is the start of, in this phase as well, being able to take a look at the impact on operations, taking a look at the day-to-day operations, and you start doing it here. In the confirm stage, this is where the rubber really hits the road, if you will. You start taking a look at the sequencing of utilities. Building on that initial review of the operations, you start taking a look at how to sequence the utilities to maintain the operations of the school against the phased occupied renovations. There's a majority of it occurring during the school year. So you have to understand how to phase those utilities to maintain the educational environment. Similarly, you have to maintain the actual integrity of the building itself. Depending on the phasing itself, there may be an internal space that needs to actually be renovated, and to understand, can the building handle that? Can it actually, is it possible to access it even during the school year? And that's when we start talking about potential summer work. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later on. And then as far as the actual swing space requirements, that's when it really starts getting into where is the actual swing space requirements on site. And then, Joe, if you want to touch on the local building officials, this is key.
Yeah, this is the key one, because it's, hello, folks. If we have a great phasing scheme that we think is going to work, but all of a sudden we are still transgressing the maximum egress distances that the building code allows, we're in trouble. The phasing of building has to always still comply, so that building has to be completely functional and operational in terms of the building code throughout the process. So you can't just block an entrance without thinking ahead about where's the alternate route.
And so recognizing this early on in the process, that we're doing phasing as early as concept design in some instances, we're doing it throughout the entire process, but engaging the building officials early in the process is crucial so that you don't run into a problem in permitting and or even, God forbid, in construction that runs into a situation where there's a major issue. And lastly, we're talking about refinement, refining. This is when it gets very specific. That Mrs. Smith is moving to this particular trailer, this particular portable classroom in this location. taking that, communicating that to the staff, starting that with the administration, really understanding that. This is when that refinement occurs, because there's going to be questions that come up. There's going to have to potentially be some give and take here. But then obviously validating the swing space is part of that process as well. And this is when, for example, understanding the requirements of the swing space, where it's located. And then, like I mentioned, coordination with the school administration and operational impacts.
Yeah, the going and sitting down with the school leadership is critical in all of the phasing plans that we do, because obviously they're directly affected by what's going to move. So giving them an idea of what's moving first, where we're going to start the project, where we're going to be moving, and then what things can move. Like if you build a new science wing, then okay, obviously science moves into the new wing, then what? Who do we move next? And you really have to include them and find out about what's going on with their particular programs during that period of time, so that we're moving the right people that they can afford to, and we avoid disrupting anybody that really needs to stay put until summertime.
And this is where building
things
consensus,
of that nature.
Sorry, this is where building consensus comes in even more important, because you know, again, there's going to be some issues that come up, which leads us to the last stage, adjusting. Meaning, being flexible, understanding that we need to be able to be flexible to make changes. We need to consider contingencies, and what I say here is this is being able to take a look at the phasing and anticipate potential issues. Even this is before the contractor comes on board. So consider those and be able to anticipate those when the contractor does come on board, so allowing then that the detailed coordination with the contractor occurs. The coordination with the contractor is all about adjustment. We, hopefully, have done a really great job, but understand the input and being able to take the input from the contractors, they're the ones that are actually executing it, is crucial, and that'll allow us to revise the plan as necessary.
We've actually had contractors come in and say, hey, this is a great phasing plan, but I want more space. I want to take on more. I've got a crew, I've got people, we can hit it, we've got the capacity to do it, so give me some more space. Well, then you have to come back and start rethinking that as a contingency, and then get back with the school and everybody else to make sure it's going to actually work and not have a bad impact, even though you might accelerate the construction.
Very good. So we're going to talk about key considerations. That was the process we went through, and I'll say this before I go into key considerations. The process, this is not a very linear, empirical process. There is a lot of give and take. It's a lot of squishy around the edges, but it is a lot about communication. That's one of the things. If you saw that consensus building was at each of those phases, understanding that. So the key considerations, there are a lot, and we're trying to break it down here a little bit based on our experience and put it in three lenses, if you will. If you look at these considerations through three different approaches, one is the planning aspect, the other is the operations aspect, and the other is construction. Now, looking at planning, paramount in any and all phased occupied renovations is staff and student safety. Understanding that, especially in today's world, is crucial. And planning that with the contractor is the first thing on anybody's list when it comes to planning that. And that starts off with as simple as understanding the layout of where the phases are and where the students are actually walking, understanding their interaction with the construction. It's going to be an opportunity. There will be opportunities to interact with the construction, but you have to understand what those are and make sure it's a safe opportunity. Similarly, the site circulation and access on the day-to-day operations, if you will, that there has to be separation there. You want to make sure that the buses are coming in. There's still a function going on as far as the public is concerned. There's an actual entrance, but then you have to have the separate construction access and circulation. So there needs to be a dual function and dual circulation on the site. And you want to talk?
Yeah, the building code, we touched on it a little bit earlier, but one of the things that we've found is that sitting down at this point, having a meeting with the building officials is something that's really crucial early on. Because, for example, one of the things that we do is we try to plan out laydown areas for the contractor near the building, and the laydown area maybe moves while the construction's moving around through the school. But you're also impacting the open perimeter on the school for firefighter access and all that stuff. So a lot of times we've gotten some really good feedback from the local officials on just how much laydown area that they'll allow without interruptions and defining pathways through it. So things like that are really important because they can come back and torpedo a really good phasing plan midway through the process when the fire marshal shows up. The other thing is that thinking about the infill and the addition strategy that we think is very important, because one of the things that you want to do is you want to work with constraints that you have on the site. Sometimes sites have a lot of property, okay, fine. Sometimes sites do not have a lot of property, yet you have to expand the building, so you have to start being selective about where those sites are and how they can be grabbed and added into the building construction, in the phasing program. And with that goes the temporary facilities, because the amount of temporary facilities that you can provide is sometimes going to dictate how big a phase you can take on. If you can only provide 4 quads, temporary classrooms, so 4 times 4, that's 16 classrooms. Well, then that may mean that you can only vacate 16 areas of the building if the site is extremely tight. So that's going to have a direct impact on what you're doing. And then last, sustainability is something that you have to think about, the sustainable elements of your building. If you're doing LEED or you're doing CHIPS design, that they are going to be put in incrementally. And that causes not necessarily the phasing program a problem, but the engineering and everybody else has to also be able to keep up with synchronizing that to fit together.
So that's planning as a key consideration. We look through another lens, and that's operations. I think I mentioned this before, but it's maintaining the high-quality educational environment is the key to the operations. When you start looking through that, what does that entail? What does it entail from an environmental perspective, noise, separation that occurs, smells, frankly, dust, all that goes into that, as well as coordination with the contract, understanding when the testing occurs, key schedule points at which that needs to be coordinated with the construction. Similarly, you can see that with athletics, arts, clubs, community. Sometimes, as you well know, athletics can occur as early as July, maybe even June, but there's oftentimes coordination that needs to occur there from operations, understanding when an arts schedule occurs. Speak up a little bit. All right, very good. Arts. So for example, there's a trade-off in the phasing when it comes to being able to say, depending if a phasing occurs in the winter, do you have a spring play or do you have a fall play? How does that work out? Oftentimes there's a trade-off. There's a back and forth. And then operation, and I mentioned this, clearly identifying key locations. Where is the front door during phasing? And it's going to change multiple times. So that's a critical aspect and key consideration.
One of the key locations that we find off and on is the main communications room of the school. If we're moving it, then sometimes kind of out of phase, we have to take that first, find a permanent home for the new comm room. And sometimes that can be difficult because sometimes the way the plan is going to evolve, that new comm room winds up right smack in the middle of a science lab or the home ec, one of the home ec multi-purpose rooms, something like that. So there's a lot of things like that that need to be coordinated into the infrastructure planning as key locations as well.
And the student travel times and routes, as far as operations, as soon as the actual portable classrooms go on site, how long does it take for the student to get from that back to the building? It may affect the bell schedules, it may affect the actual daily operations, and that comes into the aspect of planning a phased occupied renovation.
Recently in the news in Northern Virginia, there was a project where the temporary facilities, they did a number of quad units that were put out, and the only place that they had to put them was out beyond the softball field and the baseball field. So as Gavin was saying, the travel time back and forth between there and when you had a class back in the building was tough on the kids. Compounded by, they put it in a low spot. So we had a gully washer about 2 weeks ago, and there was news footage on the local news that night of kids walking ankle deep in water down a gravel path from the quads trying to get back up to the school.
It wasn't our project, just to be clear. But we learned from others as well, put it that way.
It was one of our clients, and so they were honest about, okay, the project we're working on, you make sure this does not happen.
And then as a fun straw poll with operations, you can see with this, we asked some students, what do you remember most about the construction at your school? What was the worst part of construction? And you can see between those two, noise, dust, smell. Imagine that, it's a construction site. So you have to manage that. But then on the flip side of the equation also, there's what's the favorite part of your construction? Seeing construction workers. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as far as phased occupied renovations are opportunities to engage the student body, to see the building differently and use it as a learning tool. And so this was just a quick, you can get a sense of what's going on, and that leads into the next lens, if you will, of key considerations is construction. And I'll let Joe touch on it, but as I mentioned, the separation, meaning from noise and dust and everything else, is crucial.
Yeah, separation, and also separation factors into a couple of other things too. For safety, security, and access. Because if you think about the building now, in today's mean world that we have, you have a building that's going to be under construction. So there may be a wing that's being renovated. There's open windows. The doors are missing because it's all being gutted and redone on the inside. Okay, well, but that's an open target. It's an open area. So you have to have a plan excuse me, that not only incorporates separation for noise and dust, but separation for security, separation for noise, and going back to the code issue, is separation for, basically you might have to maintain a fire rating with one of these walls. So planning that and integrating that into the scheme is critical. The other thing is weekly briefings. Excuse me. The briefings are critical because we plan those out that as the project gets moving closer and closer to construction, that particularly during the construction phase, that the school leadership team is briefed by the contractor every week on what's going to happen the following Monday. On Monday, we're starting here, here, and here. Is that okay? Oftentimes, the answer is no. I've got testing going on in that area of the building this week, so sorry, boys, you can't do it. We'll have to do something else. So it's a critical component because it also allows them to go back and the teachers can tell the kids what's happening. When you all get back from Thanksgiving break, guess what? The library is going to be in a different spot of the building and things are going to be looking a little bit different. And that's important for them to know so they don't get rattled and just have some organizational chaos during the class changes.
And I hope you can see that there's a lot of overlap between these three, between planning, between the operations, between the construction, and the bridge between all that is the communications aspect, building that consensus, having everybody on the same page.
Yeah, go back to the previous one.
Sure.
Wonderful.
This one here?
Yep.
Fair enough. You good? All right. So we're going to get into case studies. Thank you for, that was our warm-up. That's the basis of which we actually do a lot of the work. So let's go ahead and get into the case studies. We're going to do three schools, starting with Thomas Edison High School, Stuart Hobson Middle School, and Herndon High School. And we're going to lead off with Thomas Edison right now. Thomas Edison High School is in Alexandria, Virginia, with Fairfax County Public Schools. It was delivered as a design bid build. It's expanding from 305,000 square feet to 359,000 square feet, with a student population increase from 1,700 to 2,100, with a cost of $49.2 million, which was very advantageous when it was constructed. It was a little bit different market than it is now, I'll say that. This was a planned 3-year phase construction. We went in with our eyes open. This was part of the process, is to plan out those 3 years. And Joe's going to tell us all about this.
Okay. One of the goals that they had was to basically take a building that was built in 1960 and basically extend the life cycle on that building for another 25 years is usually the stated goal, but in reality it usually winds up being well beyond that, probably in the 35-year range. So what we're doing to the school has to count. We made some big changes to the school, added some major components, new media center and expanded administration. Science department, you can imagine 1960s science classroom is nowhere near the square footage and facilities of what you would want to have in a school that's being designed today. Quite a big difference in square feet, just as one standard. New band room and black box theater, arts department. Obviously we needed to upgrade the infrastructure, and then they already had temporary classrooms, and obviously our goal, any of our clients' goals is once the project's been done, they and the community do not want to see trailers back anytime soon. So we had to make sure that we accommodate all of those rooms into the program as well. Get sustainable design elements into the building, and then, again, it's all about them and it's all about the school. Is we have to find a way that we can have a minimal impact on their activities. We don't want to disrupt things. Some things are going to be disrupted. If you're renovating the auditorium, there's going to be one part of the school year where they're not going to either have their fall program or their spring program, but it's up to the school to decide when they can do that. Same thing with gyms, same thing with the cafeteria and the kitchen. That's a piece of work that has to be done during the summer because the kitchen, you need it. You can't run a school without having food service. So that's obvious, big time constraint. This is a bird's eye view of the site, and one of the things that we did is we identified some key areas that need to be done to address their needs. Problem with the school was the entrance, inadequate area for bus drop-off, too much mix with vehicular traffic. They did have a student drop-off area here for a kiss and ride area. Again, same kind of problem. A lot of crosswalking between trailers and the building, bad. The tennis courts here, they were just flat out in the way. They're in a bad location in terms of site locations. And then also, one of the things that they did not have was a continuous loop to be able to get around to the building, not so much for convenience, but for safety, for emergency access vehicles to be able to come around and open up the total perimeter. But as you can see, the site's spoken for. You've got athletics fields here, you've got parking all around the perimeter, and then there's very, very tight, small areas where you can think about an expansion of the building. Let's go ahead to the next. What we did was, in working out the phasing plan, is decided on a number of strategies where we could actually start adding to the building to clarify the way the bus loop works, and then also incorporate an addition with that. Incorporating the addition allows us to move people into it eventually and be able to clear out some space throughout the building. And then doing a number of small infills around the perimeter of the building too. One of the things that is an impact on the phasing is that when you're doing these infill conditions right here, in actuality they wound up improving the circulation because we were able to connect some areas of the building that currently were kind of disconnected by these sort of funny shaped courtyards and things that we had there. But you've got to plan out when exactly that area is going to be closed off and what's going to happen, because for a little while there's some pain in this area here while we're building it.
And I'll say this, you see this approach where we're not expanding dramatically. And this was a consensus-driven approach. We could have talked about adding in where that parking lot is and figuring out how to do parking elsewhere, but the intent was here was to do it more efficiently within the existing building envelope, to be able to do the infills as we need to. And there's some trade-offs. There's some understanding that all of a sudden when this gets infilled at number 4 there, that all of a sudden what had windows now doesn't have windows. How do we deal with that? How do we make sure that that's okay, and understanding potentially what the functions are in that space and repurposing it, reprogramming it? One
of the things that we planned on was location of trailers. We don't show it on this diagram here, but we had a small park here with some trailers, 3 quads, and then all along that area right up through the top there, it was just row of temporary structures. They allowed us to pull in 42 temporary classrooms. But the problem was we already had 8 sitting out here, and they were right in the way of the construction. So 8 of those 42 wound up just being, making up for the ones that they already had out there, but we needed to move them to get them out of the way. So there was a lot of ahead thinking that needed to be done. Okay, this is the layout of the building, and again, I think that the biggest piece of our approach is that the whole time that we were coming up with the phasing plan, we were meeting with the school leadership team and our client every week. We would come in and we'd show them what's going on, what we're thinking about, and get their feedback on a weekly basis. So that, one of the things we were able to do all throughout there was to put the school first. And we explained our thinking about what we needed to do and what time periods we would need to do to build a new addition across the front of the building. That's not just a year, that's actually a 16-month project. So how can we do that? How can we change that? And then once it's done, who can we move? So we went through that, and they were a part of this process all the way along. And it worked out very well because they were able to sell it to the teachers, to the students, with us, with our help, and the process went smoothly. We didn't meet any resistance with that. Our first step in the phasing program was to basically determine what areas, because it was so tight and there was limited space for temporaries, what can we put in first that's going to make a major impact? So, as I mentioned, a new media center with admin underneath. It was one of the targets for upgrades, so that gets put in as an infill in the front of the building. The other thing is that science basically occupied this area here, and they had sort of old-fashioned 900 square foot rectangular footprints for each science lab. The prep rooms in between were like closets. The current county standard is a 1,400 square foot science lab with a prep room in between. So we had a lot of ground to gain. So what we did was we renovated a floor up here in the center. We grabbed this center portion of the building, and then we're able to eventually move these folks into there so they never had to leave the building, because obviously you can't relocate a science lab practically speaking, into a trailer. So that's one of those types of facilities. So when they move, they've got to do it once and stay within the building. And then we tackled some other areas. You know, the boiler plant and so on was under construction pretty much the whole time.
If you look at the addition on the front, again, that was trying to do the best impact right off the bat, really kind of show the face of the building and the change that's occurring. So here's what the existing condition
Before.
was, and then here's where it is when it's actually
And after.
completed. After.
And one cautionary note I will say is that, you know, one of the things that you have to think about is that the phasing plan drives the architecture. It's not the architecture driving the phasing plan. This we were able to do. We took advantage of an opportunity that presented itself, but it was not, well, man, I want to really put the media center up there in the front. It was what made most sense for the building. It's where we could get the matching amount of square footage in an infill area for that and for the administration and student services area. So you take advantage of opportunities that present themselves during the phasing plan, but you don't let the aesthetics drive the plan. Okay, let's move on to
Phase 2.
Phase 2, mentioned that a little bit before, I got ahead of myself, but basically once we had this area completed, we were able to take the English department, move them, take science that was down on the first floor, and move them. Our strategy in all the phasing is to first really tackle the curriculum core spaces of the building, because that's what you want to get done first. That's what all of our clients always ask us to get done first. Math, English, science, languages, get those done, get it over with, get those places of the building finished, secure, and then you can move on to the spaces like the auditorium and the gym and cafeteria,
Yeah.
CTE spaces and so on. Just keep on moving through there, but get the academic core where the kids spend most of their time, get it done as soon as possible.
And you'll see that as a theme that repeats itself, trying to get those classrooms done, typically sometimes during the summer more so, to allow for those to be active, and then the ancillary spaces, like Joe had mentioned, can all of a sudden be done during the school year. It allows for greater flexibility. And you'll see that in the next case study, which is very evident.
One of the things that was neat about the way these things work during a phase program is that we built a new library. This was the old library. Their art department was basically a classroom, way undersized, way below standard. They didn't have a 2D and a 3D studio and all of that, and a photographics lab, computer arts. So what we did was we took the old media center and turned that into a really nice art department studio. Had a higher ceiling space, had outdoor access windows, so it presented itself really, really well. And then we were able to go back into other areas of the building and start to accomplish some of the other renovations that we did.
And one of sorry, I was going to say, the key on this renovation here was, again, you can see the majority of this between the renovation of the kitchen and the cafeteria located here, and then the actual black box, the auditorium. Again, those were spaces that occurred, the renovation occurred during the school year, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, but the cafeteria and kitchen occurred during a summer.
Cafeteria and kitchen was, right in here was,
Yeah.
strictly limited to the summer, but it had to be tied in because one of the things we were doing is we were sliding in an addition as an infill for a black box theater and a band room. And so, when we started doing that construction, we were only able to go so far, and then, we timed it so that when they really got into swinging some steel and stuff like that, it was during the summer when the cafeteria was closed and also being renovated.
And so sometimes when we do our phasing with our initial phasing plan, the more summers the better. Right now, you'll see the last case study, we're in the middle right now doing some phasing, and they're indicating perhaps taking away a summer. And that changes the entire, for a 3-year construction period, that changes the entire phasing at that point. So it's something to keep in mind. The renovation of the auditorium, specifically, I just want to share with that. You can see this was probably about as bright as it is in here, but the reality is that that's what it was, transforming that into something that can perform for performances as well as lectures with a little flexibility there.
Then moving on into the rest of the program, once we got some of these key spaces involved, then we renovated the last classroom link. So this 2-story academic core block right here was done. We put on a fitness addition right there, and then it started moving back into the athletic facilities so that those were, in terms of the educational curriculum, those were the spaces that were prioritized to go last after we've got the core curriculum areas done. Let's move on to the next one of the neat opportunities that you get is this is a corner of the building at the back where it was an existing entrance, but it was part of the kiss and ride loop that comes around through here in the foreground. And then because of the way the site infill strategies worked, we wound up putting in a new fitness center right next to the building. So it gave us the opportunity to also create a sheltered space. And again, this is one of the nice byproducts that you get with some of the phasing and some of the adjacencies that you work out in the plan, is it'll present opportunities to do something. And here we gave, technically what's kind of the back door to the school, more identity and a nicer connection between the ball fields and the kiss and ride and the parking lot to the building. That occurred back in that area right back there.
Don't worry, this is the last phase. This was, we're getting through this. This
And then,
is
and then
the
last,
final phase.
what we did was we saved the hardest spaces for last because this school had a technical academy. And so the reason we did that was not just to put off the difficulty parts, but you can't relocate an automotive shop. You can't relocate a culinary arts and restaurant program within the school or put them in a temporary facility. Those things, unfortunately, have to be shut down for a period of time. What we did was in being able to put them off until the end, we actually gave them 2 school years to be able to plan and to set up programs where students could be relocated to other facilities, and they could phase themselves into doing that so that they were ready to go. And they had been anticipating this change for quite a while, so that was the reasoning in doing that. Luckily, it was in a space where it only took about 8 months to get all the work done, and it was a 60,000 square foot wing of the building, but the contractor could access it from all sides, so they really hit that space and hit it hard. Things we learned, you have to provide ample time for the staff to prepare. The briefings are critical. It gives everybody a good framework for what is going to happen and what they need to do to help make it happen from the school side. Keep the students informed, letting them know what's next. That turned out to be very critical. Turns out that one of the funny stories is that the parents were far more apprehensive about the construction program from the feedback that we got through presentations to the parent-teachers organizations, that was very big on their agenda. And when the kids got in there and the corridors didn't have tile and they saw pipes exposed and all that stuff, everybody's walking around like, cool. The kids were actually enjoying seeing the construction going on in the building. So it's interesting to let everybody know what's next. Off-hours work for things like the corridors, for example, all that stuff has to be strictly contained to when the teachers and the kids, the staff are out of the building. Being flexible, as I mentioned before, the contractors sometimes they want more space. So sometimes it's a benefit to the project to let the contractor run when it's feasible and when it won't be disruptive. Consensus building, all the things that we talked about there. And then I think that one of the other things that is sometimes overlooked is from the early phases on is, and we've learned this the hard way, is that you have to involve your MEP team in the phasing program. They will tell us very quickly about what can be disconnected and what cannot be disconnected versus us just blowing through an area of the building and cutting off a main spine for water mains, power, et cetera, communications. So you need to basically be able to think ahead of time with the MEP team, and it even affects the way they will design the building, because if they know that they're going to be creating a cooling loop, then they have to be able to design ways that loop can be attached to and extended throughout the construction process. And it has an impact on the cost, it has an impact on the construction time.
And as a corollary to that, you can see that involving the maintenance staff along with the MEP is crucial. They know more about the way that building breathes and operates than anybody else. So having them early in the process is invaluable.
Okay.
And then Joe touched on it. One of the things you'll see, and there'll be a comparison to another project, this particular client was okay with having the corridors remain open and the students be exposed to the construction with a limited approach relative, obviously, to student safety. We need to keep that in mind. But this did, as Joe mentioned, offered an opportunity. It offered an opportunity to actually see the building in a different way. The kids loved it. Parents, not so much, perhaps. Teachers, they're kind of mixed. But it did allow for that opportunity to the students to be engaged, and it also facilitated the construction to happen more readily after hours, because they would clean up afterwards, but they didn't have to cover up, they didn't have to worry about that. So that's just an example of a key lesson learned. That's specific to this client. They're willing to do that. Going to Stewart Hobson. Stewart Hobson Middle School is in Washington, D.C., and this was a design build. Different approach there. This was a small addition or small expansion. It originally had 98,000 square feet, going up to about 114,000 square feet with very little growth in the students. A lot of this had to focus on modernization renovation. The existing building is a 1927 building. But again, this is a $44 million project, and it ended up being a 3-year phased. And I'll tell you more about that. So again, this is a 1927 building that needed to be brought up. It had some challenges relative to its existing infrastructure. It was not in any shape or fashion performing at a LEED level. It did have unique program requirements relative to museum sciences. They partner with the Smithsonian Institute and basically teach the students museum sciences. As well as an interesting story is the gymnasium. This is a 1927 building. It had 2 gyms. Each gym was no bigger than this room. And one was for the boys, one was for the girls. So that's the way they did it in 27, and so they needed something a little bit better.
Lockers in the middle.
Lockers in the middle. And because of the way this particular project was set up, the phasing had to be coordinated and aligned directly with the budget releases, which then influenced the summer blitzes. So this was a very incremental approach. The money came, then they built. The money came, so we had to try to plan that out and, frankly, adjust accordingly if not all the money came, understanding how that worked out. So it was a very valuable experience, and then typically maximizing the after-hours work. So this is the site, urban site, very tight. Nowhere to expand except for one area here, which we took full advantage of, and that's the addition. How are we doing on time, Joe?
We've got to pick up the pace.
Huh?
We have to pick up our pace.
Okay, very good. So you can see very much so that there was an addition here. There was an addition here. We basically only added probably around 20,000 square feet. We repurposed quite a bit on the inside, took advantage of basement space that had 3 school bus-sized boilers in them, put new equipment in there and recaptured space inside there, and also recaptured space in the courtyard infills. Let's go through the phasing. Phase 1A occurred, again, this is a summer blitz focused on classrooms and starting also the MEP and the infrastructure.
Interesting in sizing these phases, as Gavin mentioned, we've got a summer, it's a blitz, they can have the building for 24/7. But we actually ran into situations where the budget was big for that particular phase. They wanted to spend $7 million. And the contractor said, I can't do it. I can only get so much in place in that amount of time with the amount of space that we have available. So it's wound up that they had to actually go back and adjust some of their budget.
Right. So phase 1B, which started simultaneously with 1A, but it focused on the gymnasium and taking the gymnasium and making it one large gymnasium, as well as if you pay attention to this space right here, that is a classroom space that allowed for a swing. There was no swing on site at all. Or I shouldn't say that. There's no swing outside of the building, meaning there were no trailers. All the swing occurred within the building, and that was crucial relative to the phasing and starting the core in the summers. So you can see, here's the gymnasium. I barely fit in myself. And then expanding that into 2 gyms and adding that upper level allowed for that swing space to occur, also meet some program requirements relative to teaching space. So phase 2A starts, and that's the addition. And this is where it gets interesting. So unbeknownst to us, or out of our control, we had a change in contractor. So we dealt with that as best we could, and basically using the same process we used before, we brought them up to speed fairly quickly. This had a very active school community, so frankly, it was a fairly seamless switch over, but it did extend this phase more than originally planned. That's what took it into that 3-year component. But because it was an addition, it allowed for that flexibility.
It was interesting to do a consensus building with a second contractor and getting them reintegrated or integrated into an existing team already.
Exactly. So then phase 2B, that was again focusing on you can see the blue, that was focusing on, this is a summer blitz again, focusing on the classrooms, getting those done so when they came back in the fall, they could use those. The auditorium allowed them to stay on site. That needed to get done. That was done during the school year. And then the cafeteria and the east atrium here, there's an east atrium, and you can take, that's an infill space, which has some interesting aspects relative to phasing because it's so landlocked. And what that looks like is this. So how do you get ceiling?
Before shot, please.
Yeah, the before shot. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. That's some nice, never mind. So yeah, how do you swing steel in there? And that's why that happened when it did. It occurred during a summertime and allowed it to be transformed into this, reclaiming that space, being able to make it a collaborative space for student interaction right off the cafeteria. And the last one to occur was the media center, and that just allowed them, again, as far as a space, they could take that offline during the school year without major impact compared to the core area. And that transformed this type space into this, making it brighter, lighter, and more usable.
With 1927 infrastructure, that library that Gavin just showed you before it was renovated had steam pipes that ran down the exterior wall. And they went to the old-fashioned radiators like we see in the movies nowadays when they show a 1930s film segment of somewhere. But those things were actually a hazard. They were hot to the touch. I mean, really hot. And we managed to get rid of them. Yes, sir?
Was there any abatement work done, and when it was done, was it done?
Oh, there was extensive abatement work done. And that was all done in the summertime. What we had was, with the phasing plan, that was coordinated with the contractor so that the client had a abatement company come in, and ahead of the areas that were going to be renovated, they would be abated first and then move on. But it was all accomplished in the summer. That was the first part while the contractor was mobilizing. They were in there abating.
Came back after the initial abatement?
Pardon me?
Is there any unfound areas where you found asbestos after the original abatement?
Fortunately, no.
Yeah,
And we were lucky.
we're very lucky.
Yep.
So this is a different approach. This client did not want the students exposed to it. They wanted the construction covered up every evening. And so we worked with the contractor to provide a temporary solution that allowed for basically, for lack of a better term, tarps to be draped over the construction here. You can kind of see it open, and then they would drape it. Every night they would pull it down and then do their work and then clean it back up. It required a very high level of coordination with the contractor. Lighting had to be dropped in specifically to get below those tarps. For me, it was a missed opportunity. Just with that particular client, they didn't want, with that particular client, that particular community, they didn't want to see it. So we worked with them on that, provided the solution, but I think it's a missed opportunity to engage the students. So speaking of that community, the key lessons learned in this one is that the school improvement team, they call it the SIT team, or the SIT, and the community were actively involved in this, very active. And sometimes you can look at that and say that's a real challenge. In this instance, it was actually a true asset because that allowed us to go through all the changes that occurred in the contractor, that allowed for all the various activity that occurred on site within the building, that them to be on board with us. It was a really true team effort. Carefully assess the physical conditions. Joe just reminded me, even just now, one of the interesting things about this project in 1927 is that the buildings they have, the walls in the classrooms along the corridor are chase walls. They had steam back in 1927. 2 feet thick with terracotta. We left them in place. They go all the way down to the basement. So guess what's now coming up? That's where all your MEP is. That's where all your data. Those are now built-in chases. So assessing the physical conditions offers some unique opportunities, especially in this one. The design-build approach allowed for a really good team approach, allowed for that flexibility, a lot of the give and take. That was an active back and forth. And then an incremental lead approach. Because of the way the phasing occurred, each phase was done to a certain lead criteria with an overall vision of lead. But we wanted to make sure that each phase was done because, if you remember correctly, each phase was aligned with budgeting. So we had to make sure it stood alone in some respects with lead, but didn't overall impact the broader lead vision. So it was an interesting process to go through that. We weren't looking all of a sudden to kind of go through the lead. Each process, each phase was actually lead documented, we'll say. For a final lead accreditation, we're getting gold on this eminently right now, I believe.
Jumping back into the design-build approach, I mean, as Gavin mentioned, it was, that interaction with the contractor is good. It's excellent, and what we would urge is that having the contractor involved in the phasing program, whether it's conventional design bid build or design build process, is trying to get the contracting team involved because they give us a lot of good real-time feedback. So, I mean, we come up with what we think are reasonable schedules, but them knowing the market that there's probably going to be a hang-up with steel deliveries because steel is in such demand right now, using that as an example, that they can give us that input, and so it will help us plan because that may affect, timing of delivery of materials and interaction between that and timing of the school program when you need a space to be open and up for business. There's a trade-off there, so their input's critical.
And that also speaks to, and I'll just riff on this for a second, that speaks to the opportunity that phasing plans do expire. And what I mean by that is if we do a phasing plan as early as concept, we're carrying that all the way through permitting. Let's say the permitting process takes 2 years. At that point, you have to recognize that you have to revisit it. And that's when the opportunity presents itself, especially with the contractor, to really make sure that still the base ideas are still valid.
Yes, sir. Did you have a question?
Yeah, on the previous slide, how light safety was addressed with the drapes along the corridors?
We did end up having to bring down, I think, sprinkler heads as well. Sprinkler was installed, and they dropped down lines for those as well. So sprinkler systems came down. You can see a small one right here, but that was integrated into that process. So,
And all that material was non-flammable too. I mean, that was
Yes.
another thing. So, yeah.
So yeah, it was a interesting, yes, to say the least.
Yeah.
All right, recognizing
Okay.
our time, we're going to talk about Herndon High School. This one is hot off the presses right now. As we speak, we are actually having a meeting with the client next week on phasing. So some of this isn't as refined, so I appreciate that. But the stats with this is that this is going to be a design bid build. This is Herndon with Fairfax County Public Schools in Herndon, Virginia. It's a significant expansion. They definitely need some program space. So this is going from 292,000 square feet to 424,000 square feet with an expansion of 2,000 students to 2,500 with an $81 million budget. So a nice big project. This is focused, again, eyes open, on a 3-year construction plan. We are actively working towards that. So similar to Edison, this, again, focuses on the building that was constructed in the late 60s, early 70s that right now isn't performing. So a large component of it is modernizing it, making sure that it performs to current standards and for the next 35 years. The other aspect of this is, and you'll see on the site plan when we talk about it, it has slowly expanded across the suburban site to the point where, you know, I tell people in DC that, yeah, we're dealing with a suburban project and there's no place to go, and they kind of laugh compared to the last one, but this one has expanded and there's no place to go. And so because of that, as they've done that, the organizational clarity of the building has been compromised. And so one of the key aspects of this, one of the key project goals is to really make it very clear when you walk in the front door where to go and have that organizational clarity.
Okay. You know, the other goals that they had were obvious. Is that get rid of the modular classrooms, as we talked about before. They're going to be adding key components to get them back up into ed spec requirements. And again, you know, as we were saying, you know, it's a relatively small increase in the student capacity of the building. Yet you see the square footage going over 120-some thousand square feet. Reasoning for that is that if you have 16 science classrooms, first of all, they don't have 16, they have 12. So we're adding 4 science classrooms to meet curriculum standards, and all those rooms are significantly larger. And all the spaces that we added into the school to meet current standards are significantly larger. So oftentimes you'll see that disconnect between, you know, the direct number of kids that are going to be added to the building versus the size of the square footage of the building.
And you'll see also align the space program with the community. This is one instance when you have, as sophisticated as a client as we have as Fairfax County Public Schools, where they have their defined standards, there is some flexibility they have here relative to the community, understanding this is largely a Hispanic community, and as such, there's a greater demand for ESOL classrooms, and they're going to shift their programming requirements to recognize that.
Okay, let's take a look at the site. As you can see, Gavin described it. You can pretty much imagine where the property line is. It just pretty much runs as a rectangle, and then there's a little handle here on the end of the site and comes down. Our goals that we had for the front of the building were to basically.
There you go.
Thank you. And then there we go. And then to clarify the bus loop, again, same kind of concerns as getting a bus loop that's efficient and completely free of car traffic. Right now, for drop-off, the students and their parents, they come in around, loop around the parking lot, and they pull up along here, and then the kids go in a side entrance into the school for the kiss and ride parking. This is a hazard back here. And as you can see, there's not much. One of the other things that was nice from an environmental standpoint is back in 1980, they took a courtyard and they put a 1-story infill addition into it, creating about 8 classrooms that are underneath this roof here, no windows, no daylight, no air from the outside, and then all the rooms that were on the inner loop of the corridor were also affected. So they've got like 24-some classrooms that were affected by that. One of the things they told us,
we like, put it that way.
yeah, one of the things they told us to do is get rid of that. So we were very happy to work that into the phasing plan. Okay. So phase one, what we decided to do was to, because of the constraints that we had, up along the top you'll see a number of boxes up there. There were already 4 existing quads that were in place, and right now we're projecting that we need to have a capacity of about 48 more temporary spaces to be able to accomplish what our client wants us to do in the phasing program. To do that, first of all, what we're relying on in big time is to develop a 2-story addition to the school here. Upstairs will be the science classrooms. We put them upstairs because then you can access them from underneath, and the utilities and infrastructure maintenance and changes and upgrades are easier if you can access them from up above. They're in the new space. We can get them the right shape, the right size, and then a classroom level down below. With that, we wanted to grab, because there's going to be construction going on here, grab an area through here on an inner loop of the existing building and take out that infill addition during the summer. So this one will likely start right after the first of the year in 2017, actually in 2018, excuse me. And so what will happen is that they'll be starting on the site work, and then during the summer they'll come back and do the addition and move the kids out of the renovation space and phase it that way. So it'll not only be phase 1, but we've got a phase 1A, B, and then also that summer what we're going to do is we're going to add their new administration area and library onto the front of the building. And in that way, what we're going to do is we're going to basically take this area of the building during the summer. It'll be closed, and they'll have a temporary entrance here onto the side of the building and over here on the side of the building, where we'll have a temporary bus loop over there. And the kiss and ride will still function the way it has before, but basically the front will be done. What we're going to do is we're going to create a laydown area around here, and then to do that, we had to take the tennis courts and say adios for 1 season.